We'll be hearing them play Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony. But for now, for the next 20 minutes, we have a dreamlike reminiscence, which remembers the inhabitants of a Russian town destroyed in the First World War. It's called This Morning a Letter Arrived, and it's by Joseph Roth.
This morning, a letter arrived from my friend Naftali Croy in Buenos Aires. He's happy. He's enjoying life in the big and presumably very exotic foreign city. He's met people from home, acquaintances. They're dealing in tobacco or other goods, and they say hello to me. They haven't forgotten me, even though I was just a boy when I left them to travel west to my father's family in Vienna. The people of my town have a good memory because they remember with their hearts. I, for my part, had almost forgotten them because I've been living, and still live, in Western Europe, where the heart counts for nothing, the head for a little, and the fist for everything. Who knows where I might not have landed up had my friend Naftali Croy not also gone west? I was already in the process of losing my heart, my desire, and my capacity for love and pain, which is as strong as longing, love, and death put together. Already I had forgotten my birthplace, the little town in Russia which no longer exists, which has died, which has fallen in the Great War as if it had been an infantryman, a human being. Oh, it was so much more than a human being. It was a fertile womb from which many individuals, striking individuals, were cast out like seeds on the broad fields of the world. The town no longer exists. It has been blown up by guns, burnt down by fires, trampled upon by boots. And now the golden maize flowers where once were dirty lanes and houses, and the wind blows over the streets and pavements of my childhood. Other towns grow rich and powerful, or if they are condemned to die, death torments them for 100 years or 1,000. But our little town it abruptly mowed down with its big, sharp scythe. Now I was born nowhere and belong nowhere. It's a strange and terrible thing, and I seem to myself like a dream, without roots and without purpose, with no beginning and no end, coming and going and not knowing whither or why. It's the same with my compatriots, too. They have been scattered all over the wide world. They grip foreign soil with their frail roots, lie buried in foreign soil, have children who don't know their father's birthplace, and to whom their grandfather is a mythical figure. From time to time, I hear from one or other of them. I happen to know, for instance, that the baker, Surikin, now runs a restaurant in Tokyo, is married to a Japanese woman, and has 6 children, 2 of whom are studying in Europe somewhere. The wealthy Herr Kobritz stumbled upon Surikin in curious fashion. Herr Kobritz trades with half the world, and so, in due course, he found himself in Tokyo, sat down in a restaurant, and was served some excellent fish. The fish was completely according to his taste, and the wealthy Herr Kobritz was already beginning to philosophize, expounding his theory that the whole world was just a village, one big village, and that people were the same all over the world. How else was it possible that he could travel to the end of the world, to Tokyo, there to be served fish of the very sort that his Kobritz was very pleased with his philosophy, when the chef walked up to him, a Japanese man with thick glasses, saying, "Good evening, Herr Kobritz." So the world really was just one big village, where everyone knew the wealthy Herr Kobritz. "Don't you recognize me?" asked the Japanese man. "No," replied Herr Kobritz. "I've never been to Tokyo before." "But I knew you right away," replied the Japanese man. "I used to be the baker, Mendel Surikin, and now I've been Japanese for 30 years. Herr Kobritz came to Vienna, so I had the story straight from the horse's mouth. And I told it to my friend, Naftali, who's now busy giving it currency all over Buenos Aires. Soon everyone will know what became of the baker, Mendel Sorokin. But I'm racked by curiosity. I want to know what happened to the others. To blind Turek, for example. To Panteleimon, the gravedigger. To Pesach, the tailor. To Dr. Habich. And to Mordecai, the scribe. I can vividly remember every one of them. Pesach, the tailor, was the nonpareil of tailors. You wouldn't find another like him anywhere in the world. He knew the measurements of all his customers by heart because he couldn't write, not even figures. Often we stared through his windows, Naphtali, Croy, and I, when we returned from roasting potatoes in the fields. There we saw the greasy yellow glow of the little lamp on the tailor's table, and himself as he sat on the kitchen bench, pondering. Certainly he was busy trying to picture the dimensions of his customers, to remember their bellies and chests and thighs. When he picked up his scissors, it was as though he had them standing in front of him, and he had no trouble cutting out their coats and trousers and waistcoats. But from time to time he did make a little mistake, and so he was left with enough material to make the occasional suit for himself. Because it was only right and proper that a tailor who knows all his customers' measurements by heart should be allowed to keep a little material for his own poor, scrawny, shivering body. So what happened to our tailor? His son, I know, has been living in America for years and is also a tailor. He always said in his letters that he was the owner of a fashion house. I suppose it's not impossible that the son got his father to come to America, and that tailor Pesach is sitting in a corner of his fashion house, old and short-sighted and hard of hearing, and still unable to write. Mordecai, the scribe, didn't have any children. I think he died alone. He was a widower, and he taught writing, and he always used to carry a pen and an ink bottle around with him when he went to his pupils. But his pockets were holy, and his wife was dead, and there wasn't anyone to patch his pockets. Therefore he used to wear a top hat on his head. He kept his writing gear in his top hat. Because of that, he wasn't able to greet anyone. He had to content himself with putting one finger to the brim of his hat. That was his greeting. There was only one person whom he couldn't greet like that, and that was our burgomaster. So he always avoided the burgomaster, and when he came to a corner, he would always stop and look around furtively, and not walk on until he had assured himself that the burgomaster wasn't coming. Dr. Habich was a doctor who found anything and everything more interesting than patients and diseases. He had studied medicine in Vienna, and he would probably have liked to be a famous consultant in a big city. But just as he was finishing his studies, his father died. Dr. Habich had no money and returned home, even though his professor had told him that talented individuals were much sought after in Western Europe. There weren't any particular illnesses in our town. People had a hernia or a catarrh or an upset stomach, a broken leg, or a farmer cut himself on his scythe. These weren't the sort of things to keep a gifted and ambitious doctor interested. Year after year, with every new patient that came to him, Dr. Habich hoped to come across a grave and interesting condition. But all it was a hernia, or a catarrh, or a late birth. Then Dr. Habich stopped writing prescriptions, and if you sent for him, he never came, and gave instructions without seeing the patient. A new young doctor arrived in town who understood his business, and managed to treat a catarrh in such a way that it turned into a nice double pneumonia. People started dying in droves, and the young doctor was in constant demand, and no one ever sent for Dr. Habich. He sometimes sat in the bar that Naphtali and I used to go to, too. There were Panteleimon and blind Turek drinking and talking. Panteleimon had cut a suicide off a tree. He'd kept the rope and was looking for a buyer for it. Whoever had a hanged man's rope would get a lot of milk from his cows, his horses would thrive, the wheat would grow heavy on his fields, and he himself would be immune to the evil eye. A rope like that was worth a couple of hens among brothers, or, at the very least, a few dozen eggs. Pantalaimon didn't need money. Anyone who's been a gravedigger all his life and has seen the rich having to leave behind their 2 large rooms and kitchen and a bag of money under their pillows, anyone who's seen that 100 times over doesn't want money. "Think of the worms," says Pantalaimon each time he sees a big wedding procession. He always thinks of the worms. But now he has his rope to sell. Who can fit us up with a purchaser? Who is familiar with everyone's requirements? Who gets to go everywhere? Who sees everything? Blind Joseph Turek, the brushmaker, who learnt his handiwork at blind school in the big city and always talks about the beauty of the city as though he'd had a proper sight of it. He knows it better than a sighted person because he is blind. "I wouldn't sell the rope to one single purchaser," says Joseph Turek. "Fool," replies Pantalaimon. "It's only a single rope." "Just a moment," says Turek. "Who's the fool? Why not turn it into many? You get a hen for each one, and you go on selling pieces of rope all your life." "Now, unless I'm very mistaken," objects Pantalaimon, "I'm somewhere between 60 and 65, and I want to live to be 100. So how many years have I got left?" 35 or 40. "You see, there's not so much rope that I can go on selling it for 40 years. "Who says it has to be the same rope? When the first one is finished, you just cut another one in little pieces." "But a rope that hasn't hanged anyone isn't going to be a lucky rope," said Pantalaimon. "All ropes are lucky," retorted Joseph Turek. And he's right. Such were the conversations you might catch in the bar at night. I drank schnapps there, even though I was barely 10 years old, but Naphtali Croy, who was 8 years older, had honoured me with his friendship, and so I just had to play at being older and drink schnapps. It tasted not at all bad. In fact, it tasted very good, and it kept me alive when I returned from potato roasting, tired and chilled to the marrow. We set out early. The fogs were still hanging over the earth and over the autumn morning, which looked like an old man, silent and dumb and all swaddled up. The crows sat on the swaying branches for minutes on end till you thought they were grown on like big, mournful autumnal fruit. Sometimes we threw stones at them. Sometimes we brought one down, picked it up, and were invariably alarmed by the crooked, sharp beak, which was like a little 2-edged sabre. Willows smelt bitter and narcotic. There was a reek of mould and putrescence. The damp passed through the soles of our boots up into our bodies. We flapped our arms to get warm and stomped about on the stubble fields and breathed into our cupped hands. On the edge of the woods, lonely animals peeped out shyly and furtively. Exhausted late beetles crept over the furrows, black and gleaming like bits of coal. The clouds stood insistently in the sky like a curse in waiting. It was only afternoon, and the western horizon began to redden with the sun we couldn't see. We hadn't seen it rise in the morning. We didn't see it at the height of its powers at midday. We only saw its final decline, its flat beams and its painful red reflection in the evening clouds. The wind got up on tiptoe and set off on its nocturnal walkabout. At the same time, a few yellow lights started to flicker in distant hovels, like sparks struck by the wind. Naphtali whistled the song of the miller whose wheel turns, whose years pass. From our little plume of smoke, we could tell that the wind had changed. Only yesterday it had been from the north. Today it was from the northwest, and the first snow would be with us in a few days. Already I longed for its small, hard, cutting stars and its lashing, annealing sharpness in my face. The smell of our roasting potatoes was like a kind of home to us. The crows had become used to the smoke by now, and had returned to their boughs, where they spread their wings from time to time without taking off, maybe just to give us a fright, or because they themselves were frightened. And long, tall, lanky, red-haired Naphtali walked home with long steps. I scuttled after him and couldn't keep up. I got back to town 10 minutes after he did. He was standing in front of the bar, waiting for me. It was the saddest autumn of my life, the autumn that Naphtali Croy went to Vienna. The war and the revolution were over, and the countries and peoples were still trembling, even though the storm that had shaken them was already moving off. I was a poor bastard. I had nothing but my rucksack. My rucksack had my coat in it. The shoes I wore at the time I owed to an embarrassing act of charity. They were patent leather boots. That happened to be the pair my benefactor could do without. The leather was cracked, and all the damp of the rainy autumnal world seeped through their thin soles. When I cleaned the mud off them, they glowed startlingly. They were a traumatic present. Then Naphtali Croy arrived, blown from east to west like everyone else. He arrived with the poor, the refugees, the prisoners of war. He was poor, and so was I. Together we were even poorer than we were separately. But we were friends, and friendship is a great wealth. If Naphtali had had a regular job, it wouldn't have been so bad. But he was just a coachman. At the age of 20, he had married a widow with a couple of half-grown children. The widow was 40. She owned a cab with a horse. Her husband, the coachman, had been a drunkard and died insane. Now the poor horse stood in its little stable, whinnying, and in the yard stood the cab with its broken windows spattered with grey mud, with its sorry shaft that rested glumly on the ground. The sight broke Naphtali's heart. Every day he looked into the stable and the yard, till one morning he impulsively hitched up the horse to the carriage, climbed up on the box, and trotted along to the station. Visitors arrived. Naphtali was in luck. He stayed up on his box. Every day that trains arrived, he rode to the station. He married the carriage and got the widow and the children thrown in. During the war, the town was occupied by the Austrians. They requisitioned the carriage, the horse, and Naphtali Croy. The horse died on the battlefield. Frau Croy died at home. The children were taken off by typhoid fever. The carriage was a piece of junk abandoned somewhere. Only Naphtali was healthy. He went to Vienna. On the way there, he stabbed a Hungarian who had attempted to rob him of his new yellow boots.
David Horovitch was reading This Morning a Letter Arrived by Joseph Roth. It was translated by Michael Hofmann and produced by Connor Lennon. You're listening to BBC Radio 3.